Hello guys, welcome back to Literature Information. Today we will talk about on an interesting topic which is war and its effects. In this video we will know about war, that is a meaningless and a useless thing. From the eyes of Wilfred Owen, we will discuss Futility poem. This poem was written by Wilfred Owen in May 1918 when he was serving as an officer in the British Army in the World War I. It describes a reaction to seeing the body of a soldier lying on the ground, and it was written only 6 months before Owen himself was killed. So, although he was only 25 at the time, this is a late poem by Owen. Futility is a type of poem that has a long history. The elegy in the ancient world. The word elegy was a formal description, meaning a poem that was written in a specific type of couplets. And elegies were written on range of subjects, including love as well as war and death. But for the past 500 years or so, the term elegy in English poetry has come to mean a lament, usually for someone who has died. It's a war poem. It does not mention the war at all, or describe the disaster as a soldier, or say that he died in a battle. But the fact that we know this was a young man who died at a war, and that it was written by another young man who would soon be killed in the same war, that is the part which makes this poem heartbreaking. It also gains in power by being read in the context of some of Owen's other poems, which are much more graphic in their description of the horrors of war and much more savage in their criticism of those he held responsible for the carnage. Futility isn't exactly light relief, but it does offer a very different tone to the more graphic poems. And the stakes of futility, so to speak, are heightened when set alongside these others. And like most of the Owen's war poems, it's deliberatory and self consciously written in contrast to the war poetry of previous eras, as a response to the new kind of war of machine, guns, trenches, mud, mortar, and tanks that he and his comrades found themselves fighting. Futility is the poem which is very much a military elegy in the heroic mode. Owen gives us a very different kind of military elegy. It's for common soldier, an unknown soldier since we don't know his name, and he is not in his dress uniform on parade with medals on his chest and cheering crowds. Instead, he is lying on the ground, probably in the khaki colored uniform that we know was worn by British soldiers at that time. The poem says there is snow on the ground and mentioned clay twice, so I can't help picturing him covered in mud. And there are no crowds to cheer him, no family or friends or lover to welcome him, but someone is watching him and feeling pity for him. And that person is a poet. Probably more than any of Owen's other poems, Futility is a poem of pity, and the poetry that he uses to express this pity is an interesting stopping point. You might even say a no man's land, and the free verse that became the mainstream poetry of the 20th century. Because even when he was appalled by the violence and the wastefulness of the war and the imperialistic tone of the propaganda that kept it going, Owen did not entirely lose faith with the past and its tradition, at least in poetry. I've contrasted Futility with Tennyson's elegy, but we know that he liked and admired Tennyson as a poet as well as Browning, Shelley, Milton, Shakespeare, Chaucer, and other great poets in the English tradition. We can hear echoes of the poetic past in Futility, but it is also in tune with the new kind of poetry being written at the start of the 20th century. And we can hear this is the very first line of the poem: Move him into the sun. It just sounds like someone talking. There is a tenderness in that opening line. Move him into the sun, and in the use of words like gently, whispering, and kind. But surely there is also an element of irony here too. I mean, do we really believe that the speaker of the poem seriously thinks that moving the dead soldier into the sun will wake him up? I have read critiques of the poem that say the soldier may be unconscious rather than dead, but the poem doesn't say so. It says the soldier's sides are full nerved, still warm, and to me that still suggests that the speaker knows he is looking at a dead body. So why does he say move him into the sun? Is he in shock and trying to deny the evidence of his eyes? Is he hoping against hope that he is wrong and that the soldier will wake up? Or is it just a sentimental gesture? Or is there a hint of bitter irony in his use of if? When he says if anything might rouse him up, the kind old son will know. I think there is beautifully just ambiguity about the tone of his first stanza that gives it a subtle but unmistakable dramatic tension. This is what stops it from tripping over into sentimentality. And this is partly because of the poem's title, Futility. This is the first word we read, and of course, it lets us know that whatever comes next will be futile, that any hope will be vain, that any light will be extinguished, that the ending will not be happy. Part of the dramatic tension comes from the gap between what the speaker of the poem knows and what the poet knows. You know that an ongoing and thorny debate. If you study poetry, you are constantly being warned not to identify the I of the poem too closely with the I of the poet. And with different poets and different poems, we can sense these two eyes being closer or further away. In Owen's war poems, it feels like he is deliberately bringing the two eyes as close as he can. Part of the point and the power of his poetry was to act as witness, to speak of unspeakable events as accurately and truthfully as he could. So, on one level, futility feels like an attempt to recording his thoughts and feelings as vividly as he can, to get as close as possible to that experience. But doing it in poetry, as in any art, requires a certain coldness, a certain distance. Otherwise, he would be overwhelmed by the emotions. So, the poetry is in the pity, but writing poetry also requires a certain absence of pity. And the fact that the poet knows that the speaker's hope is futile adds that layer of dramatic irony to the first verse. And then in the second verse, we get a shift of perspective away from the soldier lying on the ground and towards a kind of cosmic, almost biblical language and imagery. Like, think how it wakes the seeds. Woke once the clays of cold star. So the it here is the sun. And Owen first reminds us how the sun wakes the seeds every year in the natural cycle of the seasons. And then he takes us back in time in that resonant line where he says the sun woke once the clays of a cold star. So this is going back to the creation of life on earth, a cold star where the sun's warmth was essential to waking life from its glaze. Then we get three rhetorical questions starting with this one. Are limbs so dear achieved? Are sides full nerved, still warmth, too hard to stir? In other words, is it really so hard for the sun to stir these limbs and wake the soldier? And of course, we know the answer to that. The final two rhetorical questions are more abstract. Was it for this the clay grew tall? Oh, what made fatuous sunbeams toil to break Earth's sleep at all? Here we've gone beyond the individual tragedy of the dead soldier to the futile waste of life in what Owen believed was not only a brutal but also a stupid and senseless war. But he doesn't stop there, that at all. At the end of the final line makes it clear that he is questioning the whole point of life in the face of death. Why bother living at all if we all end up dead? It is a question many writers and philosophers have posed down the ages, and they have come up with all kind of answers. But not many of them have put the question so eloquently or so pointedly. And let's pause and smack up that really surprising adjective fatuous that Owen uses to describe the sunbeams. It is not particularly poetic, is it? It's usually applied to silly or trivial people. So it's really surprising to have it applied to sunbeams and the sun, which are usually described with reverence by poets. Even a poet as cynical as Philip Larkin wrote a poem called Solar, which sounds like a devotional hymn. But fatuous is perfect for the anger, the exasperation that the speaker feels when faced with so many unnecessary loss. And before we hear the poem again, I can't help remarking on another layer of context that is all too real for us right now. The fact that right now on mainland Europe, only a few thousand miles east from where Owen fought in the trenches, Ukrainian and Russian soldiers are engaged in brutal trench warfare. Poetry won't do them any good, any more than it did the soldiers in World War One. As Owen said in his preface to his poems, these elegies are in no sense consolatory to this generation, they may be to the next. All a poet can do today is warn. That is why the true poet must be truthful. So it's depressingly easy to relate to Owen's sense of futility in the face of war. But if there is any kind of redemption for the human race or any chance of lessening the risk of crunch on this scale, then surely it also involves Owen's sense of pity. The word pity doesn't appear in this poem, but it must have been in Owen's mind as he wrote. Maybe that is why it rhymes with the poem's title, Futility. In the last section of our lecture, I will tell you about Wilfred Owen, the writer of this poem, who was an English poet and a soldier, who was born in 1893 and died in 1918. He was part of a generation of distinguished war poets that fought in the First World War. He volunteered to fight in spite of his pacifistic beliefs. He was awarded the Military Cross, one of the highest honors in the British Army, for his leadership and courage on the battlefield. Only a handful of his poems were published in his lifetime, but the rest were published posthumously and form a major and influential body of war poetry. He was killed in action in November 1918, exactly a week before the end of the war. That's all for today. Hoping you are getting my point. See you in the next video. Take care.